Hi everybody, thank you for taking the opportunity to join me and watch my video. I apologize, I'm kind of suffering from a cold right now, so if you hear some sniffles, it is attributed to that. So, getting together with the family over Thanksgiving, I always get a cold. So, I apologize for that. I also apologize I was going to use a PowerPoint presentation to kind of enhance the information being presented upon, but unfortunately I could not figure out how to share my screen with you all, so you're stuck with me. I apologize. Before we start, I wanted to pose the question to all of you and, just kind of get your brains thinking about the topic that we're going to be discussing today. I want you to think about a time when you felt uncomfortable in a social situation because of how close you were to somebody. I know for me, I was in New York City walking in Manhattan, and it was the first time I had ever been there, and I thought everyone was way too close to me, especially since they were all strangers. Why is that? Have you felt that in a business setting? Well, that has to do something with what we call spatial zones. Now, spatial zones, we'll get into a little bit of discussion regarding the definition, but just keep that in mind as to, in your business world, when have you been uncomfortable regarding how close you are to somebody? Now, spatial zones can come in 4 different categories. That would be the intimate zone, the personal zone, the social zone, and the public zone. So, as we talk about our spatial zones, just remember that those are the 4 categories that they all fall into. Now, before we get into the actual definitions of each of those 4 categories, I want to talk about the actual definitions of spatial zones. It seems like an easy thing to comprehend, but there's no actual, set definition when we're interacting in a day-to-day basis. But our book defines spatial zones as established proxemic zones in which we interact with one another. Now, very big words there. In other words, they're basically zones which we are comfortable interacting with those we know and with those we consider strangers. So each person coming from those people we know, going to those people who are strangers, are instituted in each of those different spatial zones. And they can be different for each person, across cultures, across genders, but mainly as Americans, we fall into 4 different spatial zones. And as I said, those are the intimate zones, the personal zones, the social zones, and the public zones. So let's start with the intimate zone. The intimate zone is anywhere from 1.5 to 2 feet, very close to one another, and that is reserved for those who we are psychologically close with, a significant other, very close family members, close friends, and this is a space that I felt really uncomfortable in when I was in New York City. So when this space is invaded by other people, our tendency is to really jump back. It might not even be a conscious thing. I found myself a lot when I was in New York just really backing away from people, especially on the subway. And I found it very interesting that other people didn't do the same out there. They get used to living in New York City. They're used to closeness. I'm used to living in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, a big city, but also very, very open. So the next zone that we are discussing is the personal zone. Now, this constitutes the edge of the intimate zone to about 4 feet. This is also reserved for close friends, but others can enter it if only for a couple moments. What we see as Americans is often in introductions. So if you see someone shaking somebody's hand, you really do have to get into that personal space. And as after that introduction is completed, those people often take a step back. And we'll get into that social zone in which they can have an actual conversation. The social zone is anywhere from 4 feet to 12 feet. And this is the space that we're going to conduct most of our daily communications, especially in the business world. So as managers, this is very important space for us to occupy. Now, the important thing to remember about spatial zones is that as you go, your spatial zones will decrease as the more comfortable you get with somebody. So as managers stepping into a position, we're most likely going to start out in that social zone. We don't know our employees very well. They're not comfortable with us or our management style yet. So we're going to keep our distances with one another. However, as you get more comfortable, you're going to continue moving that relationship closer and closer till eventually it can get into that personal zone. I've seen this in my own experience when I first started at my first facility that I was managing in Hudson, South Dakota. I was a very young administrator. I was 22 years old, and I was managing people that were in their 50s and 60s. They felt very, very uncomfortable with me, especially my nurses, who did not feel comfortable taking direction from someone who was just out of school, which is understandable. But the more we got to know each other, the more we understood that I can learn from them, and they could potentially learn from me. So we really got into that personal space, especially when we had meetings that we needed to discuss resident care. The next zone is the public zone. Now the public zone is 12 feet and beyond, and that's really the distance at which we keep strangers. So again, going back to my New York story, I wasn't comfortable there because complete strangers were really invading my personal and intimate space. Very little communication of a business nature happens within this zone. So as managers, we really wouldn't experience a lot of this unless we're at some sort of conference or educational setting. So public speech is really where you're going to see a lot of this kind of spatial zones. Now, it is also important, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, to understand that each different culture, gender, each individual has their own definitions of their own spatial zones. So different cultures will implement different ways to keep their spatial zones safe. As you can see, I'm sure you've seen in your experience, if you've been in a group, working in a group project with somebody that you don't know very well, they might set up their notebook strategically around them without even knowing it to identify, this is my barrier and this is a space that I don't want you to cross. One way that I kind of identify my own spatial zone when I'm dealing with new clients, potential new residents, is in my office. I have my desk set up in a strategic way that really shows that I don't want to, get into a sort of personal conversation here. I do also have a different desk in my office, though, that is set up. It's a circular table with 3 chairs around it, and I often hold personal meetings, so with my director of nursing, my environmental services director, those people that I know well, I will invite to get closer to me. So the important thing for us to remember in managerial communication is that understanding these spatial zones will really let us know how willing someone is to communicate with us. It shows that we need to be able to form trusting relationships so we can move out of those public zones and social zones and into those personal zones where we can have meaningful discussions with our employees. If we never form those trusting bonds with our employees, we're never going to be able to get our messages across as far as our culture, as far as our overall organizational goals. So understanding those spatial zones can be a major tool for us as managers. Now, in conclusion, spatial zones are those zones in which we feel comfortable interacting with anybody from our close personal friends or our loved ones all the way to strangers. Starting from the intimate, you go out further into the personal, into the public, and then finally into the social. As managers, we're going to do most of our communication in either the personal, in either the personal or that public space. But our goal as managers should be to get from that public space into that personal space so we can have those meaningful discussions. Now think about that time that you were uncomfortable. Have you figured out why you were uncomfortable? And have you understood that in each different region or in each different culture, different people are going to have different ideas of what their spatial zones are. And it's up to us to understand how we can identify those and best use them to our abilities to be effective leaders. Thank you very much for joining me today.